Hi, I'm Richard Herman. I'm an immigration lawyer based in Cleveland, and some people refer to me as an evangelist for welcoming immigrants to cities across America as a way to grow the population, attract entrepreneurs, and ultimately create jobs for Americans and make our cities more vibrant. I started this crusade, I guess, as a Clevelander. And I was born and raised. I love my hometown. And I graduated from Case Western Law School in 1993 and decided to pursue my dream abroad and move to Russia. And I lived in Moscow for 2 years as an American lawyer. And my job there was basically helping Russian entrepreneurs move to the United States and expand their businesses. So that's where I really fell in love with immigrant entrepreneurs. I started to see the resolve, the resilience, the passion to surmount any obstacle. But that's really where I fell in love with, I think, the United States, which sounds like a cliche, but really when I fell in love with Cleveland. You can't see the beauty of Cleveland until you're on the outside looking in. And on the outside looking in, I was like, wow, what a great city. It's got so many natural resources, intellectual capacity, and talent, and great infrastructure. And so when I moved back to Cleveland in 1995, 96, I saw a city on the decline. The city was depopulating. We're losing companies, we're losing jobs, and we were just in free fall. And that continued for many, many years. So when I started my law practice in downtown, helping immigrants, I started to see a connection between my work with immigrants as an immigration lawyer and the potential future of the city to embrace immigration as an economic development driver. My office is on East 9th and Superior, and I could almost envision as I walked to work every day the tumbleweeds going down East 9th as the empty streets were just so blatant. And I met a guy who was a journalist from the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Bob Smith, and Bob wrote about immigration and demographics and later became the economic development reporter for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And Bob and I struck up a friendship, in part because we were both writing about the same things and talking about the same things around immigration, but also because of our families. Bob and I are married to women from abroad. We're, at least I'll speak for myself, a lazy white guy from the Midwest, and I married a woman from Taiwan. And Bob the same way. His wife was from South Korea. And we both had young children, and so we started becoming drinking buddies to commiserate, like we can't keep up with our immigrant spouses. It was all about education for the children and Suzuki violin and Chinese acrobat lessons and competitive swimming, And so Bob and I were saying, and he's in the Plain Dealer down Superior Avenue, a few blocks from me. He says, Rich, maybe immigration is what Cleveland really needs. It's what we're experiencing in our home lives, this energy and vigor, and maybe this is the secret sauce of getting back into the new economy and getting back into the game, training the Cubs to compete outside the den, as they grow up. And so we said, look, maybe we should write a book about it and start to research the stories of people, of immigrants creating jobs and creating companies, but also what cities were doing around the country on this issue. So we sold the idea to a publishing house, Wiley Publishing, the largest business book publisher in the country. And they said, great, we love the idea. Go around the country and gather stories from the billionaires, from the bodega owners, the immigrants that started these companies. We want to help raise awareness in America that immigrants are not job takers, that immigrants are job creators. Right? So what we found was staggering. We found the new research coming out of Stanford and various Duke University and Harvard, that immigrants are twice as likely to start a business than American-born. Immigrants are twice as likely to file a patent compared to American-born. Immigrants are more likely to have relationships overseas in emerging markets. So immigrants were an incredible resource for cities looking to reinvent economies and grow the economy. And Silicon Valley is a good example of that. Right? Half the companies in Silicon Valley were founded by immigrants. So Google, PayPal, Intel, Yahoo, YouTube, eBay, these are all immigrant-founded companies. So a city like Cleveland or Pittsburgh or Detroit looking for new answers to reposition and pivot to a new economy, why aren't we looking at immigrants as a resource? Now, Cleveland, we started looking and studying Cleveland. We learned that only 5% of the population, less than 5%, is foreign-born. That was a bad sign because the national average is about 13% in the country, and the cities that are really popping economically are 20-25% foreign-born. I testified at City Council in Cleveland a couple years ago. Not that they had any real interest in the issue at that time, but I said, listen, if you really want to see what we're talking about, forget the white papers and the research and all that. I'm not sure if they're reading anything anyway. Let's get on a bus, and I'll drive the bus, and we'll go to Toronto, 5 hours to the north, and we'll see what happens when a Great Lakes cold, gray city embraces immigration and see what happens. And our fears of the city being destroyed and people losing jobs and housing values dropping are just that. They're fears that are not founded in fact. What we'll see in Toronto is a city that is a global city. It's morphed into a global city. 50% of the population is foreign-born. They are just popping, and they have a housing problem too. Their housing problem is the values keep going up, right? So when I look at Cleveland, I see all these abandoned properties, and they want to demolish or mothball these homes. I don't hear people saying, well, why don't we attracting immigrants or welcoming immigrants as part of the equation? So that's really why we wrote this book, is to try to change the perception that immigrants offer incredible value to our community, and we should be figuring out ways to make them more part of our community, part of our Cleveland family. And the conversation that I've heard in so many rooms in Cleveland, and in boardrooms and in political offices and foundation offices, is just the exact opposite of what other cities are doing. And so that's why we wanted to start that conversation. I think what really drives me is the joy of being around people that are different from me. Like, I really love that. I love being, a stranger in the strange land, and the word grok, comes to mind if you guys remember the Robert Heinlein book, science fiction book. But it's cool. It's fun to get outside your comfort zone, experience new foods, new cultures, new ways of praying. As a matter of fact, in our house, my wife and I, we bought a home a few years ago. It was owned by an Hindu family, and there's a temple in our house, a Hindu temple with a 6 foot high, 6 foot long, carved stone temple. And it was funny because I'm raised Catholic. She was raised in a Buddhist family in Taipei, but went to a Catholic school in Taipei. So this is really about connecting all these different backgrounds and leveraging that to make us stronger, not weaker. So I enjoy going to different restaurants, whether it's the Ethiopian restaurant in Cleveland down the street in St. Clair, or the Arab restaurant in West 25th, or whatever. You can travel the world right in your own city, or get on a plane for $500 and travel halfway around the planet. So to me, that is really the opportunity, that the world is open, and you can access resources and people and talent from around the world. So why not do that? And I think one of the challenges in this globalization conversation is, what about people that are left behind? And the word is, the feeling is, there are people here that don't have access to that, and by definition, they will be left further behind if you pursue this. And I think that is a misguided notion. Actually, we can all go together. One of the things we talk about is, can we connect some foreign investment into urban areas in Cleveland? I represent the Chinese Merchants Association, and we're seeing money flowing from China into certain parts, certain streets in Cleveland for rehab and development. Why not connect them to African American business communities and leaders here in Cleveland? Why not, when we go to China, we invite our African American friends to go with us? Let's do this together. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, and I think that's too much of the conversation. Is when we talk about diversity, we usually talk about it in Cleveland. It's a white or black issue, and the rest of the world is not talking that way, or the rest of the country. It's a broad spectrum of race, of nationality, of gender, of sexual orientation, and everybody deserves a seat at the table. So that's what drives me. I think unlocking the power of diversity, both for personal joy and also for economic growth, because everybody has something special to offer, everybody, no matter what their background is. And the key is taking joy in that and connecting those resources. I think what I'd like people to do is to reach out, and in Cleveland, let's talk about Cleveland, which I think is a very siloed community. As living in the former Soviet Union, this reminds me of a Soviet-style city in many ways. The power structure is siloed. It's a controlled-down economy with a few players, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce, the foundations, or City Hall, and political leaders. And there doesn't seem to be a free flow of information, a free flow of ideas in many ways. And there's even efforts to stop free flows of ideas. So I think what we really need is for people to kind of get out of their comfort zones, I'd love to see people connect across cultural and racial lines in a much more significant way. I mean, why can't we have an incubator in Cleveland that connects African American businesses with immigrant businesses? Actually, one of my favorite books is called Immigrant Minority Entrepreneurs, edited by John Sibley Butler, who heads the entrepreneurship program at the University of Texas. He's African American. In his introduction, he says, African Americans and immigrants have a lot in common. And he said they're both outsider groups from the in some ways disconnected from the mainstream, but also they're both entrepreneurial groups. He said, one of the things that we know, the data shows immigrants are entrepreneurial. They're twice as likely to start a business than Americans. But we also know that African Americans were the most prolific entrepreneurial group in America in the early part of the 20th century. And this was because of exclusion. I mean, hardcore, brutal exclusion, where communities like in Huff or different parts of Cleveland could not even come downtown to shop, let alone get a job. So in Huff, you had your own barber, you had your own lawyer, you had your doctor. Everything was there and self-contained. So there was a forced entrepreneurship, but it thrived. And so I think what Dr. Butler recommends is that we connect to that entrepreneurial spirit, and that's another thing I would hope more of us do, is look at immigrants and minority communities as reservoirs of entrepreneurship, untapped, unleveraged entrepreneurship, and that we should all be benefiting from that, and we should all be connecting to that and reanimating that inner entrepreneur, that inner immigrant. It's in our DNA, and the government's not going to save us. Big companies are not going to save us. Entrepreneurs, I think, hold the key to a lot of growth and innovation and job creation in America. The Kauffman Foundation does the research on entrepreneurship, and they said that nearly 100% of all net job creation in America since 1985 comes from companies less than 5 years old. So while big businesses were destroying 1 million jobs a year by outsourcing or inefficiencies or closure, new companies less than 5 years old were creating 3 million jobs per year. So that's where the action is. So so that should be where I think our energy and our creativity should be focused. How do we encourage more entrepreneurship? So again, the pie is not limited. We can grow the pie. It's not a limited, it's a zero-sum game. Let's go global. And let's harvest the resources that exist at the intersection of us and them. The future, I think, is already here. And one of the writers I love to read is Drucker, Peter Drucker, who's an immigrant. Was an immigrant to the United States. He passed away from Austria, and he's obviously one of the key management gurus of all time. But he was also a demographer. And he said, one of the most powerful forces in America, in the world, in terms of business and social change is demographics. And he said it's also the least understood and often the most ignored by policymakers and even business leaders. The changes in demography are thought to happen slowly and very incrementally. In reality, they happen very, very quickly. And by the time you notice it, the changes have already happened, and you may not be able to adapt quickly enough. So looking at the very micro level, you can see what's happening. And in America, we're undergoing radical transformation. 13% of our population is foreign-born. Actually, Asians now are faster growing than Latinos. The largest source of Latino growth is not immigration; it's birth. If you look at the percentage of interracial marriages over the past 20, 30 years, it's went from like 1 out of 27 to 1 out of 16, and now it's like 1 out of 7. So when people say to President Obama, you got to put a moat around the country to keep all this diversity from coming in, diversity is happening in our homes, and you're going to put a moat around the bedroom. This is happening, and so let's celebrate it. And I love watching TV commercials now. I was watching an NBA game with Go Cavs. I know you already won a championship by the time you watch this. But watching commercials now, and I'm seeing biracial families featured, in the commercial. And I have a 13-year-old and a 12-year-old, and my daughter was like 4 or 5. She asked me, am I Chinese or am I white? Or I said, you're both. You're everything. So this is really this identification with the world and a multiculturalism. I think is a very empowering experience, not alienating. It's a future. So demographics, I think, I wish more people would look at that and say, okay, I understand what's happening. How do we leverage it? How do we make our communities stronger by acknowledging demographic changes, making those that are outside feel more inclusive? and building strategies around that, whether it's business strategies or other types of social engagement strategies. I don't care whether you're selling Pepsi or politics or Pampers. I mean, you got to know about these communities and what resonates with them, what resonates with the Hispanic community. And when we talk about the Hispanic community, we're not just talking about one monolithic community. There's a Puerto Rican community, which is very vibrant, which is American-born, right? Then we've got Mexican, we've got Guatemalan, Salvadoran. They have mixed immigration status. Some are citizens by 2 or 3 or 4 generations. Some are undocumented immigrants who just came 5 years ago. Who are these people and what resonates with them? So that's what I hope, and I hope that in cities like Cleveland, we don't think about crossing the river from the east side over the Cuyahoga to the west side as being the trip. The trip really is now thinking and traveling and doing across time zones, right? Getting on planes, getting on the internet, making connections around the world, pulling all these resources and knowledge together and saying, I can make something special. Well, by day and by night, I'm an immigration lawyer. I'm an immigrant rights lawyer, and we have a law firm, and we speak over 12 languages, and we help immigrants and companies that hire immigrants with various legal issues. And I'm an advocate for immigrant rights. So I see my work in writing about the economic benefits of welcoming immigrants as an outgrowth of my role as an advocate for immigrants. I guess I'm tired of hearing of immigrants being treated as liabilities or as a threat. Listening to Lou Dobbs on CNN all those years. The immigrant invasion is on. They're going to destroy American life. They're going to destroy your barbecue in the backyard. They're taking your jobs. At one point, he was saying they're bringing leprosy into the United States and gang warfare and all that. I'm like, that's not my experience. My experience is that I represent immigrants from all over the world, and some of them are. I represent NFL teams. They're bringing in kickers from Canada and Mexico. I represent researchers from the Cleveland Clinic. I represent undocumented workers in Paynesville and in the farming fields. What I see is incredible work ethic, incredible dedication to family, love of this new adopted country, a patriotism that exceeds most Americans that I know that have been here for 4 or 5 generations, and a willingness to risk everything. And my daughter Isabella was about 4 or 5. She heard me, her mom and me talking about immigrants a lot in the house. And so one day she tugs my sleeve and says, "Daddy, what is an immigrant?" And so I'm like, well, how do I explain this? And so I thought, well, how would I explain it to Lou Dobbs? That's probably the same demographic I would be speaking to, age-wise, mental-wise. And I said, well, honey, immigrants are heroes. They sacrifice everything for their children, and it's all about the future. And it's about believing in an ideal and working really, really, really hard to make it happen, no matter what the cost. And so she's like, wow. She said, "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to be an immigrant too." And I'm thinking, I chuckled and I said, well, you probably will, Isabella. You'll probably be immigrating to China or India. But the reality is, this is the new frontier, and on diversity and economic development, and we're just coming to grasp with the globalization, and with cities like Cleveland, in Pittsburgh, Detroit. Pittsburgh's in a better position, but I think the question is, do we have to be punching bags for globalization? Can we actually turn it around and harness those connections for growth and economic opportunity? And I'll give you an example. China is looked at as the taker of American jobs. We should be flipping that and saying, how can we attract Chinese investment to create manufacturing jobs in America? And we already have an analogy for that and precedent in Japan. When Japan started investing heavily in the United States in the 1970s, the fear was Japan will own us. Japan will take our jobs, will destroy America. What happened? Japan created manufacturing in the United States. And they started auto manufacturing and major installations around the country, creating great, well-paying jobs. That could happen with China, and I think it's going to happen, because I think China is starting to look at the United States, particularly the Rust Belt, and saying, we can invest here, we can do some manufacturing here. A case in point is in Dayton. A Chinese company spent $200 million and bought an abandoned GM factory. And they've already put, I think, 100 people to work, and they're hoping to put up to 1,000 people to work in an automotive glass factory. So if you want to attract these resources as a community, you have to know how they think, what they're looking for, what their culture, their thousands of years of culture mean, the dance of business conversation and developing relationships. I don't see that happening overnight. One of my clients in Cleveland bought a large warehouse, and he's from China, and he went to some folks and said, "What do you have in Chinese that I could market, Cleveland in China with?" And they said nothing, and there didn't seem to be an interest to even translate materials. So, and that was a few years ago. I think it's getting better now. But my client ended up getting the video of Cleveland, of the sexy footage of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Lake Erie and Cleveland Clinic, and sending it to Hong Kong, and then hiring a journalist to superimpose against the video and talk about the attributes of Cleveland. So I think that's what we're going to see happening more and more is, working on that side of the aisle. So where do I spend my time? I mean, I spend my time largely with my law practice. We're an immigration law firm in Cleveland, Columbus, Detroit, and with my family. I'm with my family all the time. Got young kids at home, so we're always doing something and traveling a lot. My son's a competitive swimmer, so we travel around the country doing that. We'll be in Baltimore this weekend. So that takes up a lot of my time. And I represent immigrants on immigration issues, civil rights issues. I represent companies that hire immigrants, people from the Cleveland Clinic that are doing medical research, NFL football players, tech workers, undocumented workers in the fields. We do all that. I think one of my passions, though, which I see as an outgrowth of my role as a lawyer and advocate for the immigrant community, is trying to initiate this conversation that immigrants add value. In that immigrants should be part of our economic development strategies and inclusion strategies in cities across America, particularly cities that are struggling and depopulating like Cleveland. Cleveland continues to depopulate despite a resurgence in downtown dwellers and the young people moving in apartments downtown. The new census data shows from 2010 to 2014, Cleveland continues to depopulate. And it's not just Cleveland, it's Cuyahoga County. It's one of the leading number 2 counties, I think, in the country on depopulation. So, we were a city of 950,000 people in its heyday. Now we're down to 382,000 people. I mean, how do you sustain all this infrastructure and all this when you have dwindling population and you have dwindling real estate taxes and all this stuff? So that kind of consumes me. So how do I change the mindset that immigrants can be part of the solution, they're not the problem, in a city that's only 5% foreign born, or in Detroit, 6-7% foreign born? So to me, it's really about education. So how do we educate communities and people to think differently about immigrants? So one way was we wrote the book. Bob Smith and I wrote a book called Immigrant Inc. And because of that book, I started getting speaking invitations around the country. Mayor Bloomberg hired me through an initiative he started called the Partnership for New American Economy. And that's a coalition of 500 major CEOs and mayors around the country who wanted to take this conversation out into the streets, into the communities, and listen, immigration is a growth opportunity for cities. It's not a problem, it's an opportunity. So liberal cities like Oklahoma City, Des Moines, Raleigh, Charleston, they all invited us and to come speak to their chambers. Cleveland's chamber, unfortunately, said no, thank you. We don't want to have this conversation in Cleveland. But to me, this is what we got to do. We got to talk about tangible ways using immigration law that we have right now to leverage and unlock this opportunity. And I'll give you an example. I was recently hired by Governing Magazine to speak at a retreat of the top 100 innovative leaders at local government around the country. See, they went off to an Omni resort off an island off the Florida coast, and it was a lot of tech leaders were there as well, Microsoft, Oracle, Intel, and so we were talking about how can cities unlock the opportunities in immigration. Well, the federal government is sitting on their hands, not doing immigration law reform. We've got these major problems with immigrant tech talent leaving the United States because we're educating them as international students. Now we're kicking them out to go compete against us and start new companies over abroad. What can we as cities do? And so the answer, I think, is, first of all, acknowledging that this is a local issue, not just a federal issue, that we have an opportunity now to do what we can at the local level to retain international talent, to attract international talent, and to take care of those undocumented folks that are in our communities right now, sending their kids to our schools. They're part of our family. So we got to have a local strategy on immigration. 2, we got to understand immigration policy and immigration law to unlock the key. So I'll give you an example, and I wrote this in Governing and the Governing article. I talked about a real case that I had where an international student, she's from Taiwan, she had a graduate degree in fashion design. She came into my office with these big eyes and a little bit of moisture, a little bit of dew there, and she's with her boyfriend. She says, I'm graduating, and I don't want to go back to Taiwan to go back home. My home is now the United States. I lived here 5 years. This is my home. My boyfriend's here. And so what do I do? And she knew she probably couldn't get an H-1B professional worker visa because we have a lottery, and then the lottery is exhausted like the first week of the window opening. So she knew she probably couldn't get a work visa. So her options were limited. I said, have you ever thought about starting a business? And she's like, no, I never really have. I said, well, we have a visa program for 80 nationalities that if you invest a relatively small amount of money, you can start a small business, whether it's a internet website company or a restaurant or whatever. You could apply to stay here on that treaty investor visa called the E2 visa. So I said, here's the website for the government, and they'll explain it. So she says, okay, I'll talk to my parents about it. So she came back 2 weeks later and said, we're ready. I said, ready? We'll do what? We're going to do the restaurant. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And her parents were going to invest in her. And they'd already been investing in her through their education here. So this was a continuation of their investment. And I could see the resources the family had, and they were tremendous. And I said, what a missed opportunity that communities around the country are missing. We have 900,000 international students in the country right now. It's the highest in U.S. history. 30% are Chinese. And increasing numbers of them are coming from very wealthy families. These kids are the best and brightest. Many of them are entrepreneurial. Why aren't we reaching out to them and saying, how can we help you stay? Contribute to America. Now, they're already pumping in $26 billion a year into our national economy through tuition and living expense. The real payoff, as Silicon Valley found out over the decades, is how do you help them stay, integrate, contribute their talent, and then some of them will eventually start companies. Or half the companies in Silicon Valley were founded by immigrants. Many of them were international students and stayed and graduated and worked and whatnot. So that really is one of the opportunities, is to try to help them educate. Now, what I found was the universities don't talk this language. They don't understand this stuff, and it's not their best interest. And in their minds, they've already made their money on the tuition. The city halls and the economic development groups, they really don't understand this. And politically, it may be actually disadvantage. It could be a disadvantage for them politically to push it, as we found in Cleveland. I think Cleveland politicians find that a nativist strain of discussion and policy is actually politically beneficial in the short term for them. I mean, how else do you explain our mayor in front of 1,000 people at State of the City address when asked why aren't we welcoming immigrants like other cities? His response was because we take care of our own. So first of all, who are our own? And two, how do we take care of our people? We open up and welcome the world. That's one of the ways. It's not the only way. It's not the panacea and silver bullet, but it's part of it. A good example of what's happening now is Cleveland is an outlier city. We're surrounded by cities that now, with their city halls and their philanthropy and their business communities, are embracing immigration as an economic development driver. So City Hall in Detroit, in Pittsburgh, in Columbus, in Cincinnati, in Dayton, in Buffalo, in Philly, in St. Louis. I mean, it's embarrassing to see what's happening in Cleveland because one person, the mayor, decides this is not a popular conversation for him. I mean, I think partly it's just because of age. I mean, I think he's from the older generation. He's got his first passport like not too long ago, a few years ago. So this is not his world, and his world is that Cleveland is a black and white town. Our politics are divided by black and white, and it's totally in contradiction to what the rest of the world, the rest of the United States is experiencing. So I'm optimistic. So I spend most of my time on this side of my life, on the passion side of educating people, as using social media to push this information out. So there's articles constantly coming out every day. Some city in the United States, often in the Midwest, saying, I want to do this. I want to start a program at City Hall where the mayor says, I want my City Hall to be open to all people. How do I do that? I want to make sure there's a language equity policy, so that I don't care whether you speak Chinese, Arabic, Hindu, whatever. We've got something here for you. You feel welcome. This is your City Hall. Some cities are saying we are going to issue ID cards, so that we don't care what your federal documentation status is, or we don't care whether you're homeless. I mean, in terms of ID, we want to make you feel welcome. We don't care if you're transgender. These ID cards can be part of saying, hey, you're part of our community. You can enter City Hall with that ID card. You can show it to a police officer to show who you are. Maybe even a bank would take it as ID, and you can open up a bank account. Cities are doing that across the country to build a more inclusive community. Some cities are saying we want to attract foreign direct investment. And to be an immigrant-friendly city, that means being pro-international and pro-investor. How do we help immigrant entrepreneurs? We know that they're prolific entrepreneurs, but they have barriers: language, culture. How do we help them succeed? Overall, this is about a globalization strategy. It's not just because we want to welcome immigrants because of their prolific output. It's also because we want them to affect change, I think, in our community. We want to think and act globally. We want to learn from the immigrant community, I think, and we should want to learn. Like I've learned from my wife and how she approached education in a much different way than my family approached education. So there's a lot to learn from each other. So that's what I try to spend my time on, is changing the conversation about immigration from it's us versus them, they take our jobs, we take care of our own, to how do we build a more globally inclusive community for the benefit of all. There's oftentimes a negative view about immigration and immigrants, and I think a lot of it is emotional, a psychological fear of the other and the unknown, and this can manifest ways in bad policy, but also in even violent encounters. And I'll give you an example. It's kind of started as a funny story. My wife was out of town, and I had our toddlers. They were probably age 2 and 4 at the time, and my wife didn't know this, but I decided to take the kids out to a march in Paynesville on Father's Day with the Latino farm workers. And I thought it would be important that non-Latinos would be arm in arm with the Latino community. This is not a Latino issue only. I mean, people think it's a Latino issue. They have no idea what this issue is really about. 40% of the undocumented came here legally with inspection, with a visa, and they overstayed. They're Canadian, they're Irish, they're French. They're the gamut of professions. I had a practicing brain surgeon who was undocumented. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're engineers, they're your next door neighbor. So for the media to portray this only as a Latino issue does a disservice to the Latino community and to the whole issue at large. So I thought it was important for other folks to join hands with the Latino community on this issue on Father's Day. So I dressed the kids up in their Chinese costume, age 2 and 4. And so they're going to march. So they want to march. They're not really sure what they're marching for, but they're marching. So the organizers are busing people in from all these rural counties in Ohio, and the next thing I know, the organizers are taking my kids, and putting them up front. And there's a big banner in Spanish, "We love our fathers." So all of a sudden, the kids are marching, and my kids are doing this, and Daddy, we're marching. I said, that's great. Keep going. And all of a sudden, I hear a police helicopter overhead, and I see police cruisers now. And I'm starting to think, maybe not a good idea. If my wife knew what we were doing, she would probably not be happy. But everything went well, and we ended the day, and we had a great time, and I thought it was a great experience. So as a result of that experience, there was a local newspaper story that was picked up by the O'Reilly Factor on Fox. So O'Reilly's show called me up and said, "You want to speak on TV on the O'Reilly Factor about immigration and immigrants and community building and all that?" I said, "Sure." So Michelle Malkin was the guest host that day. So I knew what this was all going to be about. It was going to be her yelling. And so I said, Michelle, I don't think you can really distill all this into bumper sticker slogans. It's really about families and building community and growing. And she started yelling and screaming and all this. And then the episode, the segment ended, and then we were off the air. And then she's on I could hear her in my headphones. She says, "Richard, that was great. A lot of fun. Let's do it again." It's all theater, folks, right? It's all theater. I get back to the office the next day, and my phone lines were lit up with messages, and they were all messages like, "Richard, we saw you on Fox. All 100 million of us saw you. The revolution is on. You're a traitor to your race. You should die. Your kids should die." So obviously my staff was not happy, my family was not happy, but this is a very small portion of the United States, but I think there's varying degrees of xenophobia that plays itself out. And and so I think that's some of the fear that I have is that diversity can be chaotic, and we got to figure out a way to kind of bring it together and leverage those connections. But if we don't know them and they don't know us, we'll never get it anywhere. But another example of kind of this virulent response, as I wrote an op-ed for the Plain Dealer a couple of years ago called "Will a Dying City Finally Embrace Immigrants?" And they put a big picture of an abandoned house on the front cover of the forum section. The back cover of the forum section was a chapter from Immigrant Inc. book that I helped co-write. And I criticized policy leaders in Cleveland, the mayor, Cleveland Foundation, I may have referenced, and the Chamber of Commerce, and not ushering in this conversation in Cleveland, of actually sequestering this conversation, and as actually a way to is actually hurting Cleveland, and so I get a call from one of the billionaires in town. He calls me up and he says, "Richard, do you want to be mayor of the city?" Sarcastically, knowing that I could barely run my little corner of the world. And I said, "No." He said, "Well, then shut the F up. Who do you think you are? You're going to create a race war in this town. You're done." And he hung up the phone. And to me, again, this is running away from the conversation of demographic changes, of globalization, of community building. I mean, we're one of the top 5 or 6 most segregated communities in the world, in the country. I mean, how are we going to solve that problem if we segregate ourselves constantly? We segregate the ideas and the communities. Let's not run away from this conversation. Let's run towards it. So anyway, that's what I spend a lot of my time on, and trying to raise awareness about this issue, and using social media to pollinate these ideas, and hopefully a few grains will catch on. I guess what gives me optimism, despite a lot of this resistance in cities like Cleveland to this idea of welcoming immigrants as a growth opportunity for all of us, is that organically things are happening anyway. So people can put up roadblocks and stop things or try to slow things down, but they can't stop the tide, the wave of the world connecting and gently colliding. So I think that's what gives me optimism, that we're moving towards this more globally inclusive community, no matter what folks will try to do, and fear-mongering and political gamesmanship. I'd like to see less career politicians driving the ship, and I'd like to see less foundations driving the ship, and more just concerned citizens coming out and saying, you know what, I think this is what I want my community to look like, and I want to be part of the future. I want to harness this. So to me, this is where the optimism is. Where I could already see it happening, and Cleveland's going to be just fine.